You're listening to Stories from the Presbyterian Pew. This podcast is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating lay people in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, about PCA church government and process. On our website, we offer free, self-paced courses to help you understand the Book of Church Order, the BCO. These courses cover how the BCO works in theory, but what does it actually look like in practice? Stories from the Presbyterian Pew gives you an opportunity to hear directly from those who have walked through or observed what happens when the wheels of church process are set in motion. The stories we share are all true and all happened in PCA churches. All names and place names have been changed to protect the identities of the storytellers and others who play a role in their stories. Our goal is to facilitate understanding and awareness. Think of these stories as case studies, embodied and brought alive by the voices of our storytellers. Hello there. I am very happy to be back with you all. This has been a very busy but happy semester for our family. One daughter got married early in the year, and I was able to fill in as a long-term sub for a teacher at our homeschool co-op who was on maternity leave. And I had another daughter who graduated high school this year and is heading towards college. So we had a lot going on, and it was good busy, but it did keep me from having the time that I would have liked to have to share stories with you all here on this podcast. I am very thankful to now have two wonderful regular volunteers who are helping with a variety of tasks at Presbyterian Pew. And I do actually have several storytellers who are ready to share their stories. I've spoken with them, and the plan is that we will record this summer. And then hopefully in the fall, I will have new storyteller episodes ready for you. One thing that I did want to let you know, just a bit of housekeeping, we unfortunately discovered that the contact forms on our website were not working properly. We're not really sure how long that's been the case, but one of the really discouraging things we discovered during testing that while the website forms were not sending contact information to us so that we could respond, they were sending confirmation messages to the people who used them. So the people who have submitted their information and asked to be contacted did get lovely notes saying, yes, we got your message and we'll be in touch with you very shortly. And then they never heard back from us. So if you tried to reach out and you didn't hear back, please try again. And of course, you're always welcome, if you can't get in touch with us for one reason or another, to reach out over Facebook, over X, over Instagram. You can always reach out to us through DMs on any of those platforms. So last year, I did several episodes just on the overtures. And this year, I want to do something a little bit different. I kind of want to give you an audio tour of General Assembly. So what I'm going to do essentially is just walk you through what happens during that week of General Assembly, and that includes what happens before the live stream, so that you know what all goes on, and also a lot of the things that I'll tell you about will give you some background and some context to help you understand some of the overtures and why they might be important. I did link in the show notes to the docket. Now, it likely will change before it's finally adopted at the beginning of General Assembly, and we'll talk a little bit about that too, but the docket will give you a basic overview of the things that go on during General Assembly week. We do have now a free online course called Presbyterian Church General Assembly 101. I've included lots of diagrams to help you understand everything, but you can go through that course step by step to understand everything from the steps that an amendment has to go through in order to change the Book of Church Order, what happens in the Overtures Committee meeting, all the different committees that are a part of our General Assembly, what they do, how people get elected to them, all that kind of stuff. So if you have questions about that, that course is laid out in a very systematic and chronological way to help you work your way through it. As I'm doing this audio tour of General Assembly, when we get to the portion of General Assembly for the report of the Overtures Committee, I will then dive into the overtures for this year. Overtures Committee report is one of the last things that happens in the business of General Assembly, so it kind of works out nice. We'll get almost to the end of our tour, and then we'll just cark at the Overtures Committee report, and we'll talk about the overtures. We'll cover about a third of them in this episode, and then in two subsequent episodes, we'll cover the rest of the overtures that have been submitted for this year. The first live-streamed event for General Assembly doesn't happen until Tuesday night, but there's a lot that goes on before the live stream is even available. So during the day on Monday and Tuesday, there are a lot of committee meetings. And a lot of these meetings are what we call committees of commissioners. A commissioner is just a person who's been sent as a representative from his church. It could be a teaching elder, or it could be a ruling elder who's been chosen as one of the limited number of ruling elders who can come as a commissioner from his church. The General Assembly has 5 permanent committees and 5 agencies. The permanent committees are the Administrative Committee, Mission to the World, Mission to North America, Reformed University Fellowship, Committee on Discipleship Ministries, and then the 5 agencies are Covenant College, Covenant Theological Seminary, Ridge Haven, Geneva Benefits, and the PCA Foundation. Each of these 10 permanent committees and agencies, and also one special committee called Interchurch Relations, they each have their own corresponding committee of commissioners. So if you've been around PCA world a while, you'll know that every year, presbyteries have to submit all of their records for review by a General Assembly committee called the Review of Presbytery Records, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But just like each of the presbyteries have their records reviewed by the Review of Presbytery Records Committee, each of these permanent committees and agencies has their records reviewed by what's called the Committee of Commissioners. So you might hear somebody say, the Committee of Commissioners on Covenant College, or the Committee of Commissioners on Mission to the World. So that is a committee of commissioners to review and look over the actions of one of these permanent committees or agencies during the intervening year. So about half of those committees of commissioners meet on Monday, and about the other half meet on Tuesday. So the actual Interchurch Relations Committee and also the Committee of Commissioners have a special lunch on Tuesday where they meet with what are called fraternal delegates. And there's like ambassadors from other sister denominations like the OPC and the ARP and Presbyterian denominations from other countries. Many of those denominations might send a fraternal delegate in person to be at the General Assembly and to bring greetings from their denomination to the PCA. So the Interchurch Relations Committee and also the Committee of Commissioners on Interchurch Relations will have a special lunch with those fraternal delegates on the Tuesday of General Assembly. Now, of course, another big thing that happens during those time slots on Monday and Tuesday are the meetings of the Overtures Committee. Usually one of the first things that happens in the Overtures Committee meeting is the adoption of a docket. And there are usually men who have a lot of experience working on the Overtures Committee who have put their heads together beforehand to prepare this docket. And just the organization of a docket can be a huge piece in helping the Overtures Committee meeting to move smoothly, because it really helps to think about a logical order for discussing the overtures, grouping together overtures that are on related topics so that you can kind of tackle all together things that might touch on similar issues. So there might be some debate or some amending of the docket, but just adopting that docket can be a really good first step in having an efficient pathway forward. But ultimately, with each one of the overtures, the goal of the Overtures Committee is to make a recommendation to the floor of the General Assembly. So the Overtures Committee doesn't decide on the overtures themselves. What they do is they make a recommendation, and then the General Assembly can decide whether or not they agree with that recommendation. There are 5 basic recommendations that the Overtures Committee can make on an overture. There are a few others, but I'm going to just focus on these main 5 that are the most common. They could recommend the overture be answered in the affirmative, which means we think this should pass. It might be in the affirmative as amended if they've made some changes to it. They could recommend that it be answered in the negative. We don't think this should pass. They could recommend that it be referred back to the presbytery. So that might mean maybe there's potential, maybe there's not, but whatever the case, it needs more work, and it needs more work than what we can really do with just some tweaks during the Overtures Committee. Another option is to refer forward, which means that the overture essentially stays in play, but is referred forward to the next General Assembly. This is usually only done for a specific reason. For example, a few years ago, before the DASA committee report, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Assault Committee report, came out, there had been a couple of overtures that related to things that were likely to be covered in the DASA report. And so prior General Assemblies referred those items forward so that they could be handled after the DASA report had been released and with reference to the wisdom and guidance given in the DASA report. It's generally not done just because they run out of time and say, oh, you guys deal with these next year. But we'll just have to see what happens this year when they have 91 overtures on their docket. Another common recommendation related to an overture is to answer it with reference. So this is, as I mentioned before, there might be several overtures that are similar. So let's say overtures 1, 2, and 3 all address the same issue. And the overtures committee decides, you know what, overture 3 is really the best way to handle this problem. So then they might recommend that overture 3 be answered in the affirmative. We think this should pass. And then they would recommend that overtures 1 and 2 be answered with reference to overture 3. So in other words, whatever happens to overture 3 should cover what was requested in overtures 1 and 2. Also, another thing that happens during the week of General Assembly prior to the live stream beginning, on Tuesday afternoons, there are a whole number of seminars. Sometimes they're vendors, sometimes they are leaders or teaching elders within the PCA who have things to present, maybe on an organization, maybe on a topic that's near and dear to their hearts. And I have never been able to attend those because the Overtures Committee always runs past the time when the seminars are taking place. But the good news is that all of the General Assembly seminars later become podcast episodes on the PCA's Gifts and Graces podcast. And I will link to that in the show notes. So if you see a seminar that looks interesting, but you're not able to attend General Assembly, you can still hear it later as a podcast episode. So as I mentioned, the main meeting of General Assembly opens Tuesday evening with worship. It is usually the largest of the 3 worship services, and the sermon during that worship service is traditionally preached by the moderator of the previous year's General Assembly. So last year, our moderator was Kevin DeYoung. That means that Tuesday evening during worship, he will preach the sermon during the worship service. After the worship service, there's usually a slight 10, 15-minute bathroom break or something like that. And then the first business meeting begins. And during this business meeting, one of the first things that happens is the election of a moderator. Now, there's a tradition in the PCA to alternate years. One year we'll have a teaching elder as a moderator. The next year we'll have a ruling elder. Since Kevin DeYoung is a teaching elder and he was our moderator last year, it would be traditional that this year our moderator would be a ruling elder. Another thing that happens on Tuesday evenings is the stated clerk's address. This is like the state of the PCA address. It's basically an overview of what's happened this year in the PCA. A big focus is growth, numbers of churches, numbers of members, things like that. Another thing that happens during this Tuesday evening business meeting is a final vote on amendments to the Book of Church Order that were passed by the previous year's General Assembly and by 2/3 of the presbyteries. In order to amend the Book of Church Order, it requires a 3-stage approval process. The amendment has to be approved at one General Assembly, and then 2/3 of the presbyteries have to vote to approve it. Right now, there are 87 presbyteries, so 2/3 of 87 have to vote yes to approve the amendment, and then it has to get final approval at a second General Assembly. Last year, there were 13 Book of Church Order amendments that passed the General Assembly. Those 13 were then sent to the presbyteries. 3 of them did not receive enough votes to pass presbyteries, but 10 of them did. So there are 10 that will again be considered for a second vote at this General Assembly. And if they pass at this General Assembly, then they will be considered official amendments and they will change the Book of Church Order accordingly. Something additional that's happening on Tuesday evening this year is the election of a stated clerk. Right before last year's General Assembly, the stated clerk, Brian Chappell, resigned. A provisional stated clerk was appointed by the administrative committee. The man that the administrative committee has nominated for stated clerk is Fred Greco, who's been a pastor in Texas for many years and is generally considered to be very knowledgeable about the Book of Church Order, which is an important asset to have if you're going to be the stated clerk. Also on Tuesday evenings, there are sometimes partial committee reports. We'll talk more about all of the different committees that report during the business meetings of General Assembly, but there are a couple of committees that could potentially recommend amendments to the RAO, the Rules of Assembly Operation, which govern the procedures of General Assembly. Amendments to the RAO require something unique. They require 2/3 of the registered commissioners. So not just 2/3 of whoever happens to be voting in that particular vote, but 2/3 of all the men who have registered to be commissioners at that General Assembly. And so current thought is that Tuesday evening business meeting is the best attended meeting. And so if you're going to get 2/3, that's your best chance to do it at that meeting. There's been some observation recently that perhaps that high point of attendance has shifted to another time during General Assembly. So maybe in the future we would see those items handled differently. But for now, the tradition has been that those items are addressed on Tuesday evenings when there's potentially the highest attendance. Wednesday morning, the first item that is currently on the docket is the ad interim committee or the study committee on revising the directory for worship for constitutional use. So currently, the Book of Church Order has 3 parts. The first part is our form of government, which covers the structure of government that we have in the PCA. The second part is the rules of discipline, which covers things like investigations, trials, censures, all the things that fall under church discipline. And the third section is called the Directory for Worship. And the Directory for Worship is not currently constitutionally binding, except for a few parts. And that's been something that's been debated off and on over the last several years. Multiple overtures have been brought to request a certain section be made constitutionally binding or be amended and then made constitutionally binding. And the idea behind this committee was, rather than do this in bits and pieces from individual overtures, let's form a committee. Let's staff this committee with men from a variety of positions and perspectives who all have some gifting or some interest or some experience in the specific topic of worship, and let them work together to revise this section and make it ready and something that the entire denomination, or at least a significant majority of the denomination, could agree to adopt as constitutionally binding. That document has been produced and it's been published, and I've read it. I personally found it encouraging, not only the document itself encouraging, but also I listened to interviews, both the Polity Matters podcast and also a group called Alliance for Mission and Renewal. They both had interviews with members of that committee and just talked about the work that the committee did and what their heart was in that work and their goals and what their experience was of working on it. I found all that very encouraging. It's not clear yet whether this committee will actually get to present their report this year and then be dissolved as a committee. There's a deadline of 90 days before General Assembly for these reports to be submitted, and this report may not have made that deadline, so there's some discussion about whether it can be presented this year or needs to wait until next year. At the moment, there is a space for it on the docket, so if it does happen, it would happen first thing on Wednesday morning. The next item for business on Wednesday morning, which could potentially become the first item for business on Wednesday morning, is the report of the Committee on the Review of Presbytery Records. Review of Presbytery Records is usually abbreviated RPR. So, as I mentioned before, every presbytery submits their minutes every year to General Assembly, and the RPR reviews those minutes. And you can look at our free online course on General Assembly for more details about how the RPR does this work. They have a good system in place for dividing up the labor that's involved. But they have a final meeting about a month before General Assembly where they go through all of the minutes of all of the presbyteries and they note anything that looks like it needs a little bit of extra attention. Our denomination's magazine, By Faith, just did an article on the Review of Presbytery Records report from 2026, and they explain a little bit about how it works. And they also explain some of the things that the RPR report highlighted this year. So I'll link to that in the show notes. It's very helpful and informative. But essentially, the RPR is going to point out 3 different types of things. The least significant is what's called notations. So these would be things like typos and things like that. Exceptions of form is the next type. And this is when there's some kind of violation to essentially the policies and the procedures for keeping the minutes. And then finally, exceptions of substance. These are reserved for when there appears to be a violation of Scripture or of the church's constitution. And again, all of these are asking presbyteries to either fix or clarify something in their minutes. During the RPR report, many things may be passed what's called in omnibus or in gross. So what that means is that the RPR, obviously after reviewing the minutes of 87 presbyteries, has many recommendations. And so a lot of that would pass in one bundle vote. However, any commissioner can come up to a microphone and say, I would like this item to be pulled out of omnibus. In other words, I'd like to take out this one item so that we can discuss it individually and vote on that separately. One interesting thing about the RPR report is that members of the RPR committee are actually allowed to participate in debate and discussion from the floor during that report. So they have an opportunity to discuss it during the RPR meeting, which happens in Atlanta about a month before General Assembly. And then currently they also are allowed to discuss and debate on the floor as the whole General Assembly is deliberating these recommendations. The next thing that will happen on Wednesday morning is a series of reports from committees of commissioners. And again, these are the committees of commissioners that met on Monday and Tuesday. They're now giving their report to the floor of General Assembly in the main meeting, and they're making recommendations that the Assembly can vote on. Those recommendations might include things like reelecting the coordinator of the program committees. So, for example, Mission to the World, MTW, Mission to North America, MNA, Committee for Discipleship Ministries, CDM, and Reform University Fellowship, RUF. Those are called program committees, and each of the program committees has a coordinator. It's like their chairperson. And so that person has to be reelected each and every year. And so that would be one of the recommendations that those committees of commissioners would propose. Oftentimes, those who are watching on the live stream may not even know that program committee coordinators are being reelected because it might be one of the recommendations that's passed in omnibus. So sometimes the chairman of a committee of commissioners just stands up and says, we recommend that items 1 through 9 be passed in omnibus. And they are, and that's that. And one of the things that just happened was that the coordinator of that committee was just reelected for another term. The committees of commissioners that are scheduled to give their reports on Wednesday morning are the Interchurch Relations Committee, Ridgehaven, Mission to the World, and Geneva Benefits. After that, the next item on the docket is the ad interim committee report from the Committee on Christian Nationalism. I don't believe that report has actually been submitted, so I don't think that we're going to hear from that committee this year, but at this moment, it still has a place on the docket. Then we will have some more Committee of Commissioners reports from Committee for Discipleship Ministries, the PCA Foundation, Mission to North America, and Covenant Theological Seminary. By the end of the day, Wednesday, there's a deadline for floor nominations. So let me explain a little bit about what that means. We've talked about all of these permanent committees and agencies, Mission to North America, Committee for Discipleship Ministries, Ridgehaven, all of these committees and agencies, they have members who serve in classes. So there might be 4 guys who are class of 2027 and 4 guys who are class of 2028. And so at the end of each year, which ends at General Assembly, there are some men who are rolling off of a committee, and then that creates vacancies. And each year, presbyteries have the opportunity to nominate men from their presbytery to fill those upcoming vacancies. The nominating committee then takes all of those nominations and they create a slate of proposed candidates to fill each of the vacancies. They only choose one candidate per vacancy. So if there were no floor nominations at all, then the nominating committee would just say, here are the men that we propose for all of these slots, and they would be approved, and they would be the new members of those committees. However, floor nominations give commissioners an opportunity to recommend somebody else that they would like to run against one of the specific candidates from the nominating committee's slate. So the deadline for submitting those nominations is about 4:30 on Wednesday, and then after that, the nominating committee meets, and they're going to check to make sure those floor nominees are eligible. So, for example, have to make sure they're not currently serving on another committee, or they didn't just have a term on this committee or something like that. And then they're also going to update their report. The nominating committee report includes bios of the men who are standing for election. So they would need to add in the bios of the men who've been nominated from the floor. Wednesday evening, there's another worship service. And then the first order of business on Thursday morning is the report of the Standing Judicial Commission. Now, this is one that I think maybe sometimes people find disappointing. Perhaps they've been following a case or they've heard about it in the news, and they're really wondering what's the latest or what happened or what did the Standing Judicial Commission think about this. Really, none of that is going to be discussed in the report of the Standing Judicial Commission. There is nothing that needs to be approved by the full General Assembly from the Standing Judicial Commission because the rulings they make are final. So their report often is more just an update. This is how many cases came to us. This is how many we've heard this year, things like that. There are then some more Committee of Commissioners reports, Covenant College, Reform University Fellowship, the Administrative Committee. Normally during the Administrative Committee report, we would have the re-election of the stated clerk if there had been an incumbent stated clerk up for re-election. But as I mentioned, this is going to be handled on Tuesday evening this year, so the Administrative Committee report won't include that piece this year. The next item for business is the Nominating Committee report, and this is what's called a special order. There are 2 special orders on the docket this year, and essentially a special order, or sometimes in other contexts you might hear it called an order of the day. Essentially it means that if the things that were happening before this are not quite done, at the time that this is scheduled, everything else stops, and we jump right to this item, and then all of those things can resume after we finish this special order or this order of the day. So the Nominating Committee report is an order of the day, which means it's going to happen at that time, even if the things that came before it aren't quite finished yet. So as I mentioned before, the Nominating Committee has prepared an entire slate to fill all of the slots, barring the possibility that they just didn't get any nominations for a slot. But they've filled all of those slots with their recommendations for those slots. And so any slots that are not contested by a floor nominee just get automatically approved at the beginning of their report. And then whenever you see an election, so if you're watching the live stream and you're seeing a vote between 2 or more people, those are only happening when there's been a floor nominee to contest one of those slots. So all of the voting that happens is to decide between a nominating committee recommendation and then a floor nominee, or sometimes 2 floor nominees or more. So all of those votes just happen right in a row. There's no debate or discussion during the Nominating Committee report. Once all of those votes are handled, their report is done. The next item on the docket is the Overtures Committee report. And this year, the Overtures Committee report is a special order. I don't remember that having been the case before. Maybe I'm remembering incorrectly, but my intuition says that this is because we have so many overtures to cover this year. The Administrative Committee, as they developed the docket, felt it was important to make this a special order so that it could happen efficiently at the right time and not be bumped back by other things that took longer than expected. Now, the voting that happens during the Overtures Committee report can be a little confusing because remember that the commissioners to General Assembly are not actually directly voting on the overtures. They're voting on the Overture Committee's recommendation on the overture. So if the Overtures Committee recommended in the affirmative, then all the people who are using their clickers to vote yes are also voting yes to the overture. But if the Overtures Committee recommended in the negative on the overture, then all the people who are voting yes to agree with the Overtures Committee, which essentially means they're voting no on the overture. So that part can get a little confusing. You just have to remember that they're voting on the Overture Committee's recommendation. So something interesting that sometimes happens during the Overtures Committee report is called a minority report. Now, minority reports can happen in other committee reports as well, not in reports from committees of commissioners, but it can happen in reports from RPR, Review of Presbytery Records. And a minority report is when a significant minority wishes to present the view of the minority. So, for example, the Overtures Committee votes a particular recommendation is approved by more than half of the members of the Overtures Committee, but there's a large enough minority who wants to also report their recommendation to the General Assembly. So what happens is both the Overtures Committee chair and the representative of the minority report have turns to present their positions. Then there might be some debate about those 2 positions. and then one of those positions is selected to be the main motion going forward, then there might be additional debate about that motion that's now the main motion, and then there would be a second vote on that main motion. So it can take a lot more time, but it really is an important part of parliamentary procedure, specifically Robert's rules, the type of parliamentary procedure that we use in the PCA. It's a significant way to preserve the voice of the minority. This was a flyby view of a lot of things that are covered in a lot more depth in our free course, Presbyterian Church General Assembly 101. So feel free to check that out if you'd like to review some of these ideas or get them in a little more detail. So now that we are at the Overtures Committee report, it is time to dive into the overtures. There are 91 overtures this year, 90 that were newly submitted for this General Assembly, and then one that was referred from last year. Most of the overtures are numbered 1 through 90, but there is one overture, the one that was referred from last year, that's numbered a little differently. If you look at it, it makes sense. It's 2025-49. So what that means is that last year it was Overture 49, and this year it's got the prefix 2025- to distinguish it from this year's Overture 49. So I've created some categories just to help me group them in ways that felt helpful for discussion. These are not official PCA categories or anything like that. We're going to talk about a third of the overtures in this episode, and then the rest of them in 2 additional episodes. Before we dive in, I just want to mention that while my discussion of these overtures is going to be fairly basic, just a simple description of what the overture does, what it's about, if you want to dive into all the ins and outs and maybe hear some different positions and things like that, there are some great resources out there. I'm linking them in the show notes. But just so you'll know, one is the Polity Matters podcast. They did a 3.5-hour episode with the 3 hosts of the podcast plus a guest, all 4 of them discussing all 91 overtures. So if you want to get into all the nitty-gritty of the ins and outs of these overtures, that's a great resource. Also, there's an organization called Alliance for Mission and Renewal, and they are putting out 3 roundtable discussions with different gentlemen who have a lot of familiarity with the Book of Church Order and with overtures. I believe 2 of those episodes have been released so far, and a third one is to come. And then also one of the hosts of the Polity Matters podcast created a resource called an Overtures Library, and it's pretty cool, actually. It has a link to the full text of each of the overtures, but also it has commentary on each of the overtures from a number of different folks. And on the main screen, you can get a quick overview of each person's recommendation, affirmative, negative, for each overture. And then you can click into it to read more about each person's commentary on the overture, and you can download a full PDF of each person's recommendations and commentary on each one if you are so inclined. So I've linked to all that in the show notes if you want to dig deeper. The first type of overtures that we're going to talk about here today are presbytery boundaries. There are 5 overtures that request some kind of boundary change. These are actually not handled by the Overtures Committee. They're handled by Mission to North America, which is the domestic missions branch of the PCA, but it also handles things like presbyteries and church planting and presbytery boundaries. So there does not appear to be any conflict or consternation about any of these overtures. They're probably going to easily pass. There are 3 overtures that request something related to study committees. The first one is the 2025-49 overture that was referred from last year. So a little bit of background on study committees. The rules of assembly operation say that there can only be 2 study committees in place at a time. And in order to overcome that limitation, it would require a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly. So to have a third or further study committee is a higher bar, less likely to pass. Last year, there were multiple requests for study committees. So 2 were approved, and this one was referred forward with the idea that perhaps it would have an easier chance of passing this year without there already being 2 study committees in place. However, it does not look like the Study Committee on Christian Nationalism will be reporting and dissolved this year. And it's unclear whether the Study Committee on the Directory for Worship will be reporting and dissolved this year. So if neither of them finish their business, then there are still 2 study committees in place, which means that a third study committee would again have to hit that 2/3 bar. So this study committee is a request for a study of AI and specifically how that's used in a church setting, in a ministry, perhaps a pastor, crafting a sermon, things like that. Overture 80 is a request for a study committee on critical race theory. And Overture 90 is a request that the study committee on Christian nationalism, which again hasn't been published yet, but a request that when it is published, appended to it would be a report that was written by 3 individuals. 2 of those individuals are teaching elders in the PCA, and the third is a man named Stephen Wolfe, who's best known as the author of a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism. There are 5 overtures that request some type of denominational prayer. So Overture 4 asks for prayer to be offered during General Assembly to give thanks for all of the adult baptisms that have taken place in the PCA. In other words, adult conversions and new baptisms. Overture 50 asks the denomination to set aside a day in September of 2026 for prayer and fasting for renewal and revival in the church. And then there are 3 overtures, 66, 76, and 89. They're fairly similar with some distinctions that I think will get some conversation at General Assembly, but they are all asking for the PCA to make a declaration of thanksgiving on the 250th anniversary of the United States. All right, now there are a handful of overtures that have to do with streamlining how General Assembly works and making it more efficient. First of all, we talked about how sometimes a lot of recommendations can be passed, what's called in omnibus or in gross, a big bundle, a bunch of recommendations passed in one vote. But sometimes a commissioner will go up to the microphone and request to have an item pulled out of omnibus. And that means that item would get its own discussion and would get its own vote. So Overture 6 recommends that the bar for pulling an item out of omnibus be raised. So instead of 1 commissioner, it would take 150 commissioners to remove that item for omnibus. And the idea there would be just that we would make sure that if we're going to take the time to separate something out and have it its own discussion, that it really does need to be something that more than just one person is interested in discussing. There are pros and cons to that, but that's the basic idea behind it. Overture 63 doesn't technically fit in the category of streamlining, but I'm putting it here because it's related to the concept of omnibus and pulling something out of omnibus. So something that happens sometimes is that a person will stand at a mic, will request an item be pulled out of omnibus, and then when it gets to the point of discussion, that person somehow gets missed in the discussion. And so Overture 63 asks that the person who requests to pull something out of omnibus be given priority to be the first to speak on that issue when the debate begins. And there was some suggestion that if Overture 6 passes and it needs 150 commissioners, maybe Overture 63 wouldn't really matter anymore, but there still needs to be that one person who makes the request. So even if we bumped up to 150 commissioner bar to actually pull something out of omnibus, we could still also approve 63 and give that requester first priority in the debate. 3 other streamlining overtures relate to RPR, the Review of Presbytery Records report. So Overture 7 would change a bit of the process of what RPR recommendations have to be approved by the full General Assembly. As I mentioned before, many things that RPR notes as exceptions really fall more in the category of needing some clarification from a presbytery. And oftentimes these issues are resolved by the presbytery saying, oh, you're right, we didn't put that in our minutes, here, we'll add it. So Overture 7 proposes that essentially RPR's recommendations or the exceptions that it takes to minutes don't need to be approved by General Assembly unless it falls into one of 2 categories. Either there have been 2 responses from the presbytery that RPR still finds unacceptable. So they've gone back and forth twice with the presbytery, and they're still not getting a satisfactory response. Or it's a matter that falls under the category of a 40-5. 40-5 refers to Chapter 40, Paragraph 5 from the Book of Church Order. Chapter 40 is the chapter that talks about reviewing the records of lower courts, and 40-5 has a phrase in it that talks about a credible report of a, quote, important delinquency or grossly unconstitutional proceeding. And something that falls underneath that category from a presbytery could potentially be referred to the SJC, our Standing Judicial Commission, which is our highest court. And it would mean that a representative or representatives of that presbytery would essentially be cited to appear before the Standing Judicial Commission. This would be similar to a trial. It's a pretty significant thing. So this is one aspect of the work of RPR that would need to be approved by the whole General Assembly. Overture 33 proposes to limit RPR minority reports to only those who voted against the whole presbytery report. So again, I didn't get up all in the weeds of the work of the RPR committee, but there may be many little votes about parts of the report of a presbytery, and then a vote on the whole report related to that presbytery. So this overture would limit only those who voted no to the whole thing as having an option of creating a minority report, essentially raising the bar and limiting the number of minority reports that could potentially be appearing during the RPR report during General Assembly. Overture 53 would prohibit members of RPR from participating in debate during the RPR report. So I mentioned before that members of the Overtures Committee cannot participate in debate during the Overtures Committee report on the floor of General Assembly. This would put that same restriction on members of the RPR Committee. The last category that I'm going to handle in today's podcast episode is a category that I am calling miscellaneous. So these are overtures that just don't seem to neatly fit into any of the other categories that I've discussed today or that I'll be discussing in future episodes. So we're just going to run through and cover what each of these individual overtures does. So Overture 13 clarifies the numbers of elders and deacons that would be needed in order to form a commission from a session. There are rules in the Book of Church Order about how many elders, teaching elders, and ruling elders you need to form a presbytery commission. This would clarify the requirements for a session commission. Chapter 5 of the Book of Church Order is about mission churches. In other words, churches that have been started. We sometimes call them church plants, but they don't yet have their own session. They are not yet particular churches. And Overture 19 seeks to add some specificity to a particular paragraph in this Chapter 5 about mission churches. Currently, Chapter 5, paragraph 8, says that mission churches should have the same relationship with the civil government as particular churches do. Overture 19 proposes to add the words "and ecclesiastical" to convey that they ought to have the same relationship with the ecclesiastical government as particular churches do. I've heard folks raise concerns that this could potentially blur the lines between a mission church and a particular church if we're just going to say that they both have exactly the same relationship with the broader church government. That's something that will be interesting to watch as discussions unfold at General Assembly. Overtures 20 and 51 relate to a unique situation, again, touching on mission churches. What happens when a particular church, for some reason, no longer has enough elders? Maybe some pass away, maybe they resign, they move somewhere else, but for whatever reason, you used to have your own session. Now you're down to maybe one elder or no elders, and you no longer have your own session. And I think sometimes folks assume that it reverts to mission church status, but that's not the case. It's in this middle third state that hasn't really clearly been defined. It's not a mission church. It's not a particular church. What is it? So Overture 20 proposes to add some language about churches without a governing body. Overture 51, addressing a similar problem, they are proposing the title of assisted churches and some language about what would happen in that situation. Overtures 23 and 25 are interesting. They are both proposed by the same presbytery from the same author in that presbytery, and they have to do with reordering two chapters of the Book of Church Order, chapters 14 and 21. They're really not adding any new language or requirements or anything like that. They're really just restructuring what's in there in order to make it clearer and easier to navigate, easier to find what you need. So it seems like the general consensus is, yes, this is an improvement, but what's the downside? If we change all the numbering of everything, is that going to mess with references in other places like older SJC cases and things like that? Overture 26. So currently, 2/3 of presbyteries need to approve a BCO amendment in order for it to be ratified by the presbyteries and move on for the third stage, which is approval at a second General Assembly. This overture would change that just a bit. Instead of 2/3 of presbyteries, It would change the threshold for approval to 2/3 of voting presbyteries, because not all presbyteries vote on the overtures or submit their votes each year. So this would change the ratio needed to 2/3 of those who actually are submitting votes each year. Overture 42, this is an interesting case. Apparently, there is a phrase at the end of BCO chapter 29, paragraph 1, that was somehow probably accidentally lost in the sands of time. And so this overture is essentially just requesting that phrase be restored. Currently, the last sentence of that paragraph says, "Nothing, therefore, ought to be considered by any court as an offense or admitted as a matter of accusation, which cannot be proved to be such from Scripture." And then the phrase that went missing at some point says, "as interpreted in these standards." So this overture says, we think this phrase should be put back, and we don't necessarily know that it needs to have the approval of 2/3 of the presbyteries, because we're really not voting to change anything. We're just pointing out that something that's there that was never removed is somehow not there anymore. So that will be another interesting discussion to watch at General Assembly. Overture 57 requires that the minutes of congregational meetings be included in the minutes that churches submit to presbyteries each year. So we've talked a bunch in this episode about the review of presbytery records. And just like RPR reviews the records of presbyteries, in the same way, presbyteries each year review the records of sessions. And so sessions are required to submit their minutes to presbyteries for review. And this overture there's some discussion about maybe people are generally already doing this. Maybe this is already regular practice, but we're just clarifying that this needs to be done each year. Instead of submitting just the minutes of the session meetings, also submitting the minutes of the congregational meetings, because there are some things that churches are required to do that wouldn't necessarily show up in the session minutes. They would show up in the minutes of the congregational meetings that were held to do those various things, such as voting on the election of officers and things like that. Overture 81 would require the organizing committee for General Assembly to serve both grape juice and wine during the Lord's Supper at General Assembly. Currently, the Lord's Supper that happens during the worship service at General Assembly is bread and grape juice, so this overture would say that wine also needs to be served during the Lord's Supper. Overture 88 is a request for the administrative committee to reformat the Book of Church Order to make it print ready for 8.5 by 11 paper. Now, to clarify, if you're out there listening, you can currently print the Book of Church Order on 8.5 by 11 paper without any trouble. Ask me how I know. You just tell your printer that you want it to fit the size of the page that you're printing on. I'm sure that's not what this overture is requesting. I'm sure they're asking maybe if there could be a version of the Book of Church Order that puts more text on each page so they wouldn't have to print as many pages. It is currently possible to print your Book of Church Order on 8.5 by 11 paper. Currently, the Book of Church Order is formatted for a little half-size binder that you can buy from the PCA bookstore. That wraps up the overtures that we are going to discuss in this episode. So just to review, what we've covered so far is overtures to change presbytery boundaries, overtures related to study committees, overtures that are requesting denominational prayer, overtures that are proposing to do things that might help streamline the work of General Assembly, and then a big bundle of miscellaneous overtures. So things that I will cover in future episodes. We have a bunch of overtures that relate to committees and agencies. So relating to General Assembly oversight of our permanent committees and agencies, how their members and chief officers are elected, things like that. We also have a bundle that have to do with the rules of discipline. So amendment to that middle section of the Book of Church Order that outlines the procedures for church discipline, investigations, trials, those kind of things. And then a section of overtures that have to do with officers, ordination, and transfers. So what are the requirements for ordination? What about the role of the assistant pastor? What happens when you transfer from one presbytery to another? And then the final group is overtures related to women's roles in the church. And there's a lot of discussion in there having to do with deacons/deaconesses/ a whole variety of other titles, and we will talk about that probably at the end of the third episode. So thank you for sticking with me as we do a quick flyby audio tour of General Assembly and the first third of our 91 overtures. and I hope you'll join us next time to continue talking about some more. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Stories from the Presbyterian Pew is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit. We are 100% volunteer run and 100% donor supported. We want to keep this podcast ad-free, but in order to do that, we need the financial support of listeners like you. To make a one-time or recurring contribution, please visit presbyterianpew.org/donate. If you are interested in learning more about the governing document of the PCA, the Book of Church Order, please check out our free self-paced courses at presbyterianpew.org/courses. And if you have a question about PCA church government or something you have experienced in a PCA church, you can reach out through the form on our website at presbyterianpew.org/contact. Towards hope and healing, I'm Lynna Sutherland with Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew.